full of signatures that are not valid, produced by people who didn't have the right to do that. The banks were making so much money so fast in setting all this up that they didn't want to waste a moment. They didn't want to spend money on officials they didn't think anybody would ever care about. And the same thing has happened again through the foreclosure process, when you have to go through lots of paperwork as well. And so it stopped for a while during the month. That is, the big banks, who are the major services and the ones who created those securities I told you about earlier, they stopped for a while. Some of them have continued to stop because they're terribly afraid of expensive lawsuits. Not only by the people whom they may throw out of their homes, but what they're really afraid of is the people who have already been thrown out of their home and can now go find a lawyer and reopen the whole business with all kinds of legal problems, suits and countersuits that would add to the costs of this colossal mess. Meanwhile, though, assuming that that gets straightened out at some point, and that's not clear it will, but assuming it does, and some of them have begun again to resume the foreclosure process, the expectation is another 3 or 4 million people will be thrown out of their homes over the next 2 years, 2.5 years, increasing the wonderful prospect that we already have in the United States of a rising number of people homeless who can sit across the street and look at millions and millions of empty homes. And, only in our country do we manage to do this on a scale that is truly colossal. All of that is continuing. None of that is stopped. There is no prospect for a serious dent in our unemployment. For those of you who pay attention every month when they announce the number of jobs, they fall far short of what would be necessary to make a dent in the unemployment. Indeed, for most of the last 6 months, the annual announcement is of a number of new jobs that is not even sufficient to absorb the new young people coming into the labor force, let alone dealing with the accumulated unemployment. And since unemployment is severely underreported anyway, the problem is in some measure worse than what we know. Last thing is, there is some fallout that is beginning to become so severe that there are societies that are literally disintegrating. And I may have mentioned this to you once before, but there's one where it is so far advanced that one really has to wonder. And that is Mexico. And so a word about that. Mexico began its catastrophic decline as an economic entity back in the 1990s, thanks to something called NAFTA, the North American Free Trade, what's the A for? Association? Agreement. What that basically did is create a common market between Canada, Mexico, and the United States, allowing much freer movement of goods and investments across these borders than had been the case before. It did, in the early days, produce some jobs in Mexico as American corporations moved across the border in Texas and Arizona and from other parts of America to take advantage of the fact that Mexican labor is, of course, much cheaper than American. The problem is, for most companies that are going to move, while the Mexican labor is cheaper, it's nowhere near as much cheaper as it is if you go to Asia. And so the Mexicans were in a tough situation. They couldn't get as many of these moving jobs as they had hoped for. But there were some, particularly along the border. Some of you know this story about the Maquiladora, these free trade areas that are set up for particularly women workers in that part of the world. But that effect was completely swamped by two others. And since I don't have a lot of time, I just want to go over one of them. And that was the movement of American retail, above all Walmart, into Mexico on a massive scale. And why was that important? Because now Walmart could go quickly and easily because of NAFTA. It was important because, as in many poor rural countries, the role of storekeeper or merchant is much more decentralized than we're used to. Every village, I'm going to exaggerate now, but not by much. Every village in Mexico has, every 15th house is a family which, whatever else it does to make a living, keeps some bags of rice and some beans and some cloth and stuff. And the local people in the village come to that family's house to do a little trading. And they make a little money by having a garage or a little adjunct building where they buy stuff from the wholesaler and they resell it to their neighbors, basically. When Walmart comes in, since it doesn't buy 20 bags of rice at a time, but 20,000 bags of rice or 200,000 bags of rice, it can get the rice at a much cheaper price than the local Mexican family that's in each village or each portion of a village. Make a long story short, millions, underscore the word millions, of Mexican people lost their livelihood. The little bit of trading they did in their neighborhood, in their back of their house, out of their garage or wherever, was was the difference between survival and no survival for them. Mexico's a poor country, and also Mexico has some of the most unequal distribution of wealth of any country on earth. It is a place that is not only poor, but the wealth that it has is concentrated in a very small part of their society. The end result, starting in the 1990s, I mean, it actually started earlier, but it really became a flood. Millions of Mexicans were faced with basically two choices: stay in Mexico and die. If not literally, then slowly from all the results of having no work, no possibility of work, and not enough income, or leave. And if you left, you can't go east or west because there's water. And there would be no point in going south because those countries are even worse shape than you're in, so you come north. You come into the United States. And starting in the 1990s and up until 2006, Mexicans left Mexico in huge numbers, which most of you should have noticed since they're all over the place, working in the restaurants and in the hospitals and in the car washes and in retail and a whole lot of places. But one of the things that brought them most was the boom in housing in the United States, construction. Mexican workers came here and became the workers who built up the housing boom that has carried our economy during the 1990s and ever since up until 2006. The crazy building boom that was fueled by all the mortgage lending that we've talked about. And this boom became even more profitable because of, instead of hiring unionized construction workers, what were hired were Mexicans, many of whom did not have legal papers, and so you could pay them anything because they'd be too afraid to go to the police or to any of the government agencies, because then the INS would find out who they were and they would get thrown out of the country. A very serious problem, very prevalent here in New York City, but across the United States as well. In the 90s and up until 2006, this solved Mexico's problem. I want to stress that. It solved Mexico's problem. Why? Mexico got rid of millions of people who would have made life in Mexico unlivable by their misery, their anger, their stealing, their rage, whatever. Those people left, and they went to the United States where they were no longer a problem for the Mexican economy, which hadn't the resource to deal with them. Or let's put it differently. They had the resources, but they were in the hands of the wealthy minority who would in no way use those resources to help those people or to hire them. So Mexico solved its problem, the end of a retail sector for Mexicans, by exporting millions of Mexicans to the United States. But it helped Mexico in a second way. Those Mexicans who came to the United States in the 90s and up until 2006 got jobs here, and they earned money, and they lived very frugally, often clumped many in small housing units together. And they did that in order to send money back to Mexico. These things are called remittances. For much of the 1990s and up until 2006, remittances were the second largest flow of money into Mexico, more important than all of their other exports, with the exception of oil. So Mexico gained twice. It got rid of millions of people for whom it had no work. And it earned tons of money coming back from each of those exported workers sharing with Mexico that part of their income in the United States that they didn't spend here. And for Mexico, it saved them from a very bad situation. However, come 2006, the good news became horrific news. As construction collapsed in the United States, as our housing market went into a decline from which it has not yet come out, the first people fired were the Mexican construction workers. Millions of them, legal and illegal. Huge numbers of them, therefore, lost their income.